Hi everyone, this is Ken Stoltzfus again. I wanted to talk to you this week about psychological assessment in young adulthood. I wanted to just start off reviewing a little bit about what Erik Erikson says about young adulthood. We're not going to be talking about Piaget any longer because he kind of stops, his theory of cognitive development stops in adolescence. So at this point, we're just going to be talking more about psychosocial development. Erikson says that in the young adulthood stage, which kind of goes from the late teens until the early 30s, somewhere in there, Erikson says that the key developmental crisis that people address during this stage is intimacy versus isolation. Meaning, am I going to be in meaningful relationships? Or if I'm unable to be in meaningful relationships, then I'm going to become self-absorbed, or at least I'm in danger of becoming self-absorbed. And so traditionally, we'd think that this is the stage of life in which people choose a career, they decide to get married, they start a family. And we'll see in a minute, some of those traditional assumptions are changing, but that's kind of historically how we thought about this time of life. I wanted to show you just a quick 2-minute video. This is Erik Erikson being interviewed about intimacy versus isolation, about this young adulthood stage. I think it's pretty interesting just to hear what he has to say. Again, if you can't hear this well, I know sometimes the video doesn't come up well on this this video lecture. If you can't see this, you can just go to the PowerPoints that I've posted, and you can click on the link for yourself.
You talk about young adulthood, and here is where you're introducing some more interesting mechanisms: intimacy versus isolation. Now, presumably you're saying then, as the individual grows beyond beginnings of dealing with the identity problem, then he now can move beyond that to this matter of intimacy versus isolation, meaning in a sense relationships with others. Isn't this what you're suggesting then?
Chris, I mean much more. I mean intimate relationship.
Intimate relationship, that's what I mean.
By that I mean friendship,
Yes.
love, sexual intimacy, marriage, and I mean psychologically even a little more than that, and which one really can understand only if one has dealt psychiatrically with disturbances of this. Namely, that intimacy is really the ability to fuse your identity with somebody else's without fear that you're going to lose something yourself. That's why it is the stage which makes marriage possible, and why marriage doesn't work if that has not developed.
But this is be consistent with the notion that many of our sociologist colleagues have suggested from their research that characteristically very early marriages, that is, early age groups, are less likely to succeed than marriages a little age
I
later.
think that is one of the main reasons, because some young people marry to find their identity by marrying, or find their identity in somebody else, which you cannot do. To be really intimate, you have to be able to have a very firm identity already.
So that's sort of interesting. Erikson is talking about this idea that intimacy means to combine myself or to fuse myself with another person, but I need to have a certain amount of ego development, ego strength. My identity needs to be fairly well formed in order to be able to do that, because if not, if I can have this sense of, oh, I need to find this other person to complete me, he says we're not really going to be able to have true intimacy. I need to have some sense of myself before I can really be in an intimate relationship with another person, according to Erikson at least. So that's sort of been the traditional thinking. But in 2000, a psychologist named Jeffrey Arnett, he went in a different direction with what happens during this stage of young adulthood. And what he actually did was he said he thinks that in the modern world, at least in the modern Western world, there's a new developmental stage that exists between adolescence and young adulthood. And he calls this emerging adulthood. And he says this basically lasts during the 20s, roughly during the 20s, this age group that we're talking about, or this period that we're talking about. And he says that what happens is that because there's been a need for much more post-secondary training, meaning that when we graduate from what we call high school in the U.S., usually around 17, 18. And I know that in the areas of the world that you're all from, I know that in Russia, people often graduate from school, secondary school, when they're about 16 and start university a little bit older. I know in Lithuania, it's more 18 or 19 from what I remember. But what we're seeing now is that even after university, people often aren't able to get a job right away, especially not a job in the field that they like. More and more fields require postgraduate training. They require experience after a job. And so what we're seeing is that people often aren't getting married, at least in Western cultures, until later in their 20s or even into their 30s. That's not unusual. So in my grandparents' age, when my grandparents' day, it wasn't uncommon for people to get married at 17 or 18 years old. When I was growing up, some in my 40s, so when I was growing up in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a lot of people got married at 23 to 25. Now we're seeing that the average age of marriage here in the U.S. is somewhere around 27 or 28 years, and it's really not unusual to wait until you're 30 or so to get married. And so, what Jeffrey Arnett is saying with this idea of emerging adulthood is that we've got so much more training that we go through. It takes longer for people to become financially secure, and that pushes back the age at which they sort of start playing adult roles, when they start doing things like getting married, having a career, having children, that sort of thing. What I don't know is how common this is in other parts of the world. Certainly Western Europe and the US, this would be the case. You can think about whether that's true for your part of the world or not. When Arnett talks about emerging adulthood, he says there's 5 kind of key aspects of emerging adulthood that sort of make it this unique developmental stage. He says this is the age of identity exploration. So other times we talk about people trying to find themselves, trying to figure out who they are during this stage. This is an age of instability. We often see people trying new things, going different places, traveling, that sort of thing during this time period. This tends to be a self-focused age because people aren't living with their families typically, and they're not married themselves yet. They tend to spend a lot more time thinking about what makes me happy, what do I want to do. This is sort of an age of feeling in between, where I'm not a child anymore, I'm not an adolescent, but I'm really not playing a fully adult role either. I'm kind of in between those two ages. It's also, in more positive terms, it's an age of possibilities. This is an age at which people still have the future open to them, and they often have a couple of different things they're interested in, and they're not sure quite what they're going to do yet. And that can be a little bit scary, but it can also sort of open them to this idea that, wow, anything could be possible right now. And Arnett says that there's some positive aspects of emerging adulthood. He claims that people may be more ready for serious relationships and serious careers and work at 30 than they are at 20. He also, however, in another place suggests that emerging adulthood can be a mixed blessings. He says, often people may be promiscuous during this stage. They may have sexual relationships with a lot of different people. They may do what we call serial monogamy, where they're with one person at a time, but they're not with the person they think they're going to be with for life. We also know that substance abuse is very common during this age. And so there's some negative sides to this age, but there's also some suggestion that well-being might improve. And there's been this kind of idea of a quarter-life crisis, that at least in the West, around 25, people have a little bit of a life crisis. And Arnett says this may be a myth. So there's some positives, according to him, and some negatives. I'm a little bit more skeptical about this development. I'm not sure that waiting 10 years to really kind of start your life and to start thinking about parenting children and that sort of thing, even biologically, we know that there's some risks the later people wait to have children. So I'm not as positive about this stage as Arnett is. And for instance, he kind of suggests that, well, if I'm with lots of different people and I kind of try out what I like and don't like in relationships, that might make for better relationships if I wait longer to kind of get serious with somebody. But, there's some research that says people that do that by cohabitating, for example, by living with different people at different times before they get married, that doesn't seem to lead to marital stability later on. So I'm a little bit less optimistic about this development than Arnett is, or perhaps a lot less optimistic. Okay, so moving on from emerging adulthood, some of the psychological and assessment issues that emerge during the young adulthood or the emerging adulthood stage, whatever we want to call it. There's some types of mental illness that emerge. Often psychotic disorders, if they're going to emerge, they happen in the late teens into the 20s for the first time. That's often when we see the first psychotic break. And And if you've had your DSM class, you'll know what I'm talking about with psychosis. If you haven't had that class yet, psychosis would be any one of a disorder. Schizophrenia is probably the most commonly known, where people lose touch with reality. They're seeing, hearing, smelling, sensing things that aren't really there. They may be hearing voices. They may be seeing. They may be experiencing hallucinations. And so these are some symptoms that if somebody's going to have a problem with this, it also often emerges during young adulthood. Also, post-traumatic stress disorder, while this can emerge at any time in life, young adults may be more likely because they're living kind of this transient life. They may be taking more risks. The textbook talks a little bit about this. There's some sense that they may be at greater risk for PTSD. Also, a lot of soldiers end up having PTSD, and young adults often make up a lot of the armed forces, especially the soldiers who are serving on the front lines in combat situations. Often they're young people, young adults, and so they may be at higher risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. Another place where psychological assessment might come in would be career selection and training. And in the US, at least, some of this starts in secondary school, what we call high school, and then also goes on into university as people are trying to decide what they want to do when they're done with university or when they're done with school. And so there are different types of career interest batteries and that sort of thing that we can give to people. We also see people psychologically sometimes need assessment because they're struggling to transition into the university. And this might be a time when either learning disorders emerge, and we might need to do some assessment. I'm not going to talk much about that today because we talked about that when we were talking about children and adolescents. Or there may be social or psychological symptoms or issues that emerge during the transition to university. People may find that they're under greater stress or that they're feeling symptoms of depression. In the U.S., I conducted a study a number of years ago that found that over half of my students at a Christian university had depressive symptoms. And so there may be high rates. There's been some other research that suggests high rates of depression and anxiety in university students, that sort of thing. As I mentioned earlier, we also see higher rates of substance abuse in this population. There seems to be something about universities, students and university life that makes people especially at risk for substance abuse. And then finally, we see relationships, romantic relationships developing at this time. And sometimes those relationships, sometimes there's reasons that people might come to a psychologist for assessment related to those relationships. And that might be anything from I want to get married and I'm trying to decide if this person is a good person for me to marry. It may be couples counseling if people are married or cohabitating or in a romantic relationship. It may be premarital counseling when people are thinking about getting married and they want to kind of work on their relationship before they get married. You may also see people who are acting out sexually, who are experimenting sexually, who are having lots of partners, and some people may really come to feel that that's an empty lifestyle, and they may actually see a psychologist to try to become better adjusted, to try to get that part of their life under control. Just an example that here in the U.S., there's a lot of university students, there's something that we call the hookup culture, meaning that people will have casual sexual relationships with people that they don't know very well or people that they're not interested in a long-term relationship with. And when we've done research on that, I haven't personally done this research, but when I've read studies about this, those people who engage in that lifestyle that doesn't seem to make them very happy. They seem to have higher rates of distress, of depression, that sort of thing. And so that may be a reason that they get in to see a psychologist for some sort of assessment. Some of the testing that we might do as part of our psychological assessment with this age group. At this point, we're solidly into the adult intelligence tests, and so some of these we've already talked about. But if we're testing someone's intelligence, we may use the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Test. It's in its 4th edition right now. We may use the abbreviated scale, the Wechsler Abbreviated Scale of Intelligence. This is a shorter test that doesn't take as long, and that's in its 2nd edition. We mentioned the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, the SB5. It's in its 5th edition. Mentioned that last time. There's also a memory scale that we sometimes use with adults. That's the Wechsler Memory Scale, and this is in its 4th edition. So those are some of the intelligence and memory tests that we might use. In terms of testing clinical populations, by this, people that aren't, what I mean is people who aren't aren't functioning very well, people with whom we suspect they may have some sort of psychopathology, some sort of a mental health disorder. There are two inventories that are used quite a bit in this field. One is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. That's in its second edition. This is this is the adult version of the MMPIA, which was the adolescent version that we talked about last week. The second inventory that's used sometimes with adult populations, clinical populations, is the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, and that's in its fourth edition. And these are inventories that would pull out psychopathology. So, for instance, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory has a scale that detects mania. So, if we suspect that somebody is suffering from a bipolar disorder, some of the manic symptoms might come up with the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. So that's sort of the way we would use those with people that we think might have a diagnosis, and we usually use them to supplement or as an adjunctive or as an adjunct to our clinical interview. Okay. Also, in terms of psychological testing with non-clinical populations, people who are functioning at a normal level, sometimes we might want to do some personality tests with them, and we might use things like the California Personality Inventory, also the Cattell 16 personality factors or the 16PF. Your book makes a note that this can be used prior to marriage. Sometimes people who are thinking about getting married will take this to see if their personalities are compatible, if the psychologist thinks they'll work well together. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is another personality inventory that we might use. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. This often is used to sort of tell you how you relate to other people, how you work best. And actually, when my wife and I, at the time my fiance and I were planning to get married, we had premarital counseling with her pastor from her church, and he had us each take the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, and it was a way of getting to know how the other person functioned. For example, one thing that I remember really well is that my wife is a very introverted person, and the pastor who had been trained in administering this Myers-Briggs Type Indicator said, you know, your wife is going to need, when you're married, she's going to sometimes just need quiet time. It doesn't mean that she doesn't love you. It doesn't mean that she doesn't want to be with you. It's just she's introverted, which means that she loses energy when she's around people all day, and she needs to kind of be alone to recharge herself. And so that was sort of helpful to me, especially when we were first married, and I'd come home sometimes, and I hadn't seen my wife all day, and sometimes she just kind of wanted to be alone, and I had to learn not to take that personally. And the Myers-Briggs was really helpful with that. So we certainly don't just use that for premarital work, but it is helpful in that. It can also be helpful in learning, in teaching colleagues how they can work to get together well, helping people to think about what kind of jobs they might be good for, that sort of thing. In terms of neuropsychological testing, the types of testing we do if someone had head trauma or some sort of traumatic brain injury. Your book mentions a couple of different approaches that we use with adults for neuropsychological testing. One that's the more flexible of the two options would be the Luria, Nebraska Neuropsychological Battery. And this, like I said, is a more flexible approach. There's multiple subtests within this battery, and they're broken down into clinical scales, localization scales, and summary scales. And these are all available to assess the problem, but we don't necessarily have to use all of them. We kind of can pick and choose between them. There's also the Halstead-Reitan battery, and that's a little bit more of a standardized approach. It's less flexible, and that's sometimes used in conjunction with the Wechsler intelligence test. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about psychological assessment with young adults. And next week I'll be back for the last video lecture, which will be about psychological assessment in middle and late adulthood. Hope you all have a good week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.